Dear listeners, today we focus on the large-scale protests that have erupted in Iran since late 2025, as well as the various forces involved, the underlying causes, and the multiple possible trajectories for the future situation. Over this period, Iran's situation has captured the attention of the entire Middle East and even the world. We will unpack the full story step by step, with all content based on public factual information, without exaggeration or subjective speculation. First, let's clarify how these large-scale protests began. The timeline dates back to December 28, 2025. The initial trigger was not a political conflict, but the most basic livelihood issues that ordinary people care about. Soaring prices and hyperinflation that had made life unsustainable for average households. The first to speak out were shop owners across Iran. As we all know, small business owners are the most vulnerable to skyrocketing costs and lost profits, and that was exactly what was happening in Iran at the time. According to public economic data, Iran's currency, the rial, depreciated sharply in those months, with its exchange rate against the US dollar plummeting repeatedly. Prices of daily necessities such as food and consumer goods on the market nearly doubled, and some even cost more than 3 times what they had a year earlier. Take the Grand Bazaar in Tehran, Iran's capital and commercial heart. Once a bustling, thriving hub, it saw many small and medium-sized shops close their doors and go on strike during that period, as their owners simply could not keep afloat. The initial demands were extremely practical. People hoped the government would stabilize prices, improve the economic environment, and allow them to do business and survive normally. For this reason, the early forms of protest were relatively peaceful, just sit-ins and holding signs to voice grievances. But no one could have imagined that this strike, rooted in economic demands, would spread rapidly within days and escalate in scale. 2 days after the strike began, student groups from numerous Iranian universities joined in. With student participation, the scale of the protests expanded dramatically, and the demands extended far beyond economic issues. In addition to anger over high prices and hardship, students raised concerns about unequal distribution of educational resources. Soon after, the middle class and farmers also stepped forward one after another. The middle class resented the erosion of their wealth due to economic instability, as finding good jobs and pursuing development became increasingly difficult. Farmers had it even worse. On one hand, they faced a severe drought, and on the other, chaotic agricultural policies left them unable to sell their produce. Their lives were made infinitely harder. By this point, the protests were no longer the demands of a single group. They covered nearly all social classes in Iran. The demands evolved from the initial fight for survival to a questioning of the existing governance model, and finally to an explicit call to overthrow the current system. Geographically, the protests spread rapidly from Tehran to the entire country. By the early stages of the escalation, they had reached more than 100 cities. Protests of varying scales erupted across the nation, from cities along the Caspian Sea in the north, 2 regions on the Persian Gulf in the south, and border cities adjacent to Iraq in the west. Among them, the southwestern city of Lordagan and several cities in the western Lorestan province have become hotspots of protest activities. The local demonstration later escalated into unrest, and direct conflicts broke out between the protesters and law enforcement officers. Faced with the increasingly uncontrollable situation, the Iranian government adopted an extremely tough measure, a nationwide internet shutdown. Its purpose is clear: to prevent the outflow of information and to stop external forces from fanning the flames through information dissemination. Otherwise, the situation would become even more unmanageable. However, the internet blackout also created a problem. The international community could not obtain real-time, comprehensive information about the true situation inside Iran, leading to a flood of rumors. This was especially true regarding casualties and arrest numbers, where official and civilian accounts diverged drastically. Iran's government released information through authoritative channels such as the Tasnim news agency, stating that dozens of people had died during the protests, while emphasizing that 111 security personnel had sacrificed their lives while maintaining order. But civilian sources, including civil society organizations and exiled opposition figures, revealed that the death toll was far higher, possibly reaching several hundred. As for arrests, Civilian reports indicated that thousands of people had been detained for participating in the protests. To quell the unrest, the Iranian government adopted a series of crackdown measures, such as deploying security forces to areas with severe protests to maintain order and arresting key organizers of the demonstrations. Iran's police chief later publicly stated that the main participants in the riots had been arrested on the night of January 10, and legal proceedings would follow for their punishment. Yet these measures failed to truly stabilize the situation. While social order partially restored in some areas and most shops reopened, the core demands of the people remained unaddressed. Tensions persisted in society, and small-scale protests continued to erupt from time to time. Although Iranian President Masoud Pezeshkian also spoke out, saying he was willing to listen to the protesters' voices and was determined to resolve economic hardships, these words did little to ease public discontent. The aftermath of the protests thus continued to linger. Having discussed the domestic protest situation in Iran, let's turn to the international reaction, especially the United States' stance and actions. For those familiar with international politics, it is no secret that US-Iran relations have long been tense. In the face of Iran's turbulent situation, the US attitude was clear. It welcomed the unrest. From the very beginning of the protests, then US President Donald Trump publicly voiced support for the Iranian people's right to peaceful protest, and warned that if the Iranian government dared to use violent repression against the protesters, the US would not stand idly by. This statement immediately sparked outrage from the Iranian government, which directly accused the US of blatant interference in its internal affairs. Iranian Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi clearly stated on multiple diplomatic occasions that Trump's remarks were a typical example of interfering in other countries' internal affairs, and that Iran would never accept this. But the US not only refused to back down, but further escalated its rhetoric in the following days. On January 11, 2026, local time, Trump told reporters aboard Air Force One that the US was considering a range of measures in response to the Iranian situation, including very tough options such as military action. He also claimed that Iran had taken the initiative to call for negotiations, but the US might take action before the talks. Actions speak louder than words. While applying verbal pressure, the US also began making practical preparations. According to multiple sources, the US deployed C-17 strategic transport aircraft from Germany to deliver large quantities of ammunition and military equipment to US military bases in the Middle East. It was obvious to all that this was laying the groundwork for potential military intervention or deterrence. Moreover, the US government was busy behind the scenes, intensively discussing specific plans targeting Iran. The Wall Street Journal reported that these plans covered a wide range of measures, including launching direct military strikes against Iran, using covert cyber weapons to attack Iran's critical infrastructure, such as power and communication systems, expanding sanctions against Iran to further squeeze its economic space, provide cyber assistance to Iran's anti-government forces to help them stir up more turbulent incidents within Iran. US officials revealed that Trump also planned to hold a special meeting with senior advisors to focus on these Iran-targeted plans. This fully demonstrates the US's attention to the Iranian situation and its determination to intervene. So what is the core goal behind the US's elaborate efforts? It is clear: to take advantage of Iran's domestic unrest to dismantle the country's existing theocratic political system and then install a pro-US regime. This is not a spur-of-the-moment decision by the US, but a continuation of its long-term Iran policy. Since the 1979 Iranian Islamic Revolution, the US has regarded Iran as a thorn in its side and has imposed continuous sanctions on the country, aiming to change the nature of Iran's regime and eliminate this anti-US force in the Middle East. A look back at history shows that the US has repeatedly intervened in the Middle East during other countries' domestic unrest to install pro-US regimes. With Iran in turmoil this time, the US naturally saw it as a golden opportunity to achieve its strategic goals. However, the US's attempt to intervene in Iran is not without obstacles, and there is considerable internal opposition. For example, Republican Senator Rand Paul publicly stated that he had no idea whether bombing Iran would achieve the US's desired results. And it might even backfire. Democratic Senator Mark Warner also said that a U.S. military strike on Iran would likely unite the Iranian people against the U.S. The lessons of U.S. foreign intervention in history are profound, and the risks are self-evident. In addition to internal disputes, the U.S. also faces numerous practical military constraints. For instance, the Pentagon did not deploy an aircraft carrier in the Persian Gulf at that time, and neighboring countries were unwilling to allow the U.S. to launch warplanes from their territories to attack Iran. These Gulf countries are well aware that helping the U.S. would likely invite retaliation from Iran, and they also fear that the collapse of the Iranian regime would plunge the entire Middle East into greater turmoil, dragging them into the fray as well. Therefore, while the U.S. wants to meddle in Iranian affairs amid the chaos, there is great uncertainty about whether it can truly achieve its goals. In stark contrast to the U.S.'s active interventionist stance is China's position. Faced with the Iranian situation, China has always adhered to its consistent diplomatic principles and maintained an objective and impartial attitude, with the core being respect for Iran's national sovereignty and territorial integrity, and firm opposition to interference in its internal affairs. On January 12, 2026, Chinese Foreign Ministry spokesperson Mao Ning made a clear statement on the Iranian situation at a regular press conference. She emphasized that China hopes the Iranian government and people can overcome the current difficulties and maintain national stability. Mao Ning also clearly pointed out that China has always opposed interference in other countries' internal affairs, advocates that the sovereignty and security of all countries should be fully protected by international law, opposes the use or threat of use of force in international relations, and calls on all parties to do more to contribute to peace and stability in the Middle East. China's position is not an empty promise, but is based on its own diplomatic philosophy and consideration of the overall interests of peace and stability in the Middle East. For a long time, China has adhered to the principle of non-interference in other countries' internal affairs in international affairs, respecting the social systems and development paths independently chosen by the people of each country. Unlike some countries, China does not arbitrarily meddle in others' internal affairs. On Middle East affairs, China has always been committed to promoting the settlement of differences through peaceful negotiations and safeguarding regional peace and development. Regarding Iran's current situation, China's stance is clear. Solutions to the problem must come from within Iran, and external interference will only worsen the situation and is not conducive to resolving the issue. This view is actually consistent with the thoughts of many Iranians. Some Iranian citizens have publicly stated that while their concerns about the economic situation and inflation are legitimate, solving these problems must rely on their own people. Relying on external forces for help will only drag the country into deeper trouble in the end. At the same time, China has earnestly fulfilled its obligations as a responsible major country by closely monitoring the safety of Chinese citizens in Iran. Mao Ning also clearly stated at the press conference that no reports of casualties among Chinese citizens in Iran had been received at that time, and China would make every effort to protect the safety of Chinese citizens in Iran. In addition, she reminded Chinese citizens in Iran to pay close attention to the local security situation, take necessary measures to protect themselves, and contact the Chinese embassy in Iran or dial the consular protection hotline if they need assistance. This measure not only reflects China's attention to the safety of the lives and property of its citizens, but also demonstrates the humanitarian spirit China upholds in international affairs. Furthermore, China and Iran have maintained normal bilateral relations and carried out cooperation in various fields on the basis of mutual respect, equality and mutual benefit. China's position has provided a guarantee for the stable development of China-Iran bilateral relations, and also injected a ray of positive energy into the turbulent Middle East. Amid Iran's turbulent situation, another noteworthy player has emerged, the heir to Iran's last Pahlavi dynasty. Taking advantage of the chaos, he publicly raised the idea of restoring the monarchy, becoming another uncertain factor affecting the situation. Some listeners may not be familiar with the Pahlavi dynasty, so let's briefly review its history. the 1979 Iranian Islamic Revolution overthrew the Pahlavi dynasty, and the last Shah, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, was forced into exile overseas, eventually dying in Egypt in 1980. His family has since lived in exile in the United States. The heir we are referring to is his eldest son, Reza Pahlavi, who, by 2025, had been in exile in the US for nearly 50 years and was 65 years old. Reza Pahlavi went into exile with his father at a young age and received his education in the US. Although he has been far from Iran for decades, he has never given up his attention to Iranian politics. As the Iranian protests escalated in late 2025, he saw an opportunity, publicly stating that the time has come and clearly expressing his desire to return to Iran, unite domestic forces, and regain control of the situation. To achieve this goal, he also sought to gain U.S. support and attempted to meet with U.S. President Trump. But surprisingly, his request went unanswered. On January 11, 2026, Reza Pahlavi spoke out about the Iranian situation once again. He claimed that the death toll in the Iranian protests over the previous 48 hours was higher than that following the US 9/11 attacks, and directly appealed to Trump, urging him to fulfill his previous commitments. It was obvious to all that he was trying to use US power to promote the restoration of the monarchy, while also seeking to expand his influence within Iran by exaggerating the severity of the situation. While the dream is grand, reality is harsh. In practice, the feasibility of Reza Pahlavi's attempt to restore the dynasty is extremely low, facing numerous insurmountable obstacles. First and foremost is the issue of popular support. Older Iranians have vivid memories of the tyranny of the Pahlavi dynasty, which is the biggest obstacle to his restoration. Although the Pahlavi dynasty implemented some modernization reforms during its rule, it was also marked by severe authoritarianism, corruption, and brutal suppression of people's basic rights. The secret police at that time brutally cracked down on opponents, bringing profound suffering to the people. The 1979 Islamic Revolution gained widespread support precisely because the people could no longer tolerate the rule of the Pahlavi dynasty. For these older citizens who experienced that dark period, the Pahlavi dynasty is a symbol of suffering, and they will never easily accept its restoration. Second, the younger generation is also unlikely to become his supporters. Young people account for a significant proportion of Iran's total population. They were all born after the Islamic Revolution and have never experienced the rule of the Pahlavi dynasty. Their understanding of the dynasty's history mostly comes from school education and the stories of their elders. In their eyes, Reza Pahlavi is an outsider who has been in exile overseas for a long time, and his upbringing and values are vastly different from those of Iran's domestic youth. The core demands of young people participating in the protests are to improve the economic situation, gain more development opportunities and social freedoms, not to restore the monarchy. They are generally skeptical of this king returning from abroad, believing that he cannot solve Iran's current practical problems and may even make the situation more chaotic. In addition, the tragic exile history of the Pahlavi family has also led many Iranians to question their governance capabilities. Reza Pahlavi's younger brother, Ali Reza Pahlavi, committed suicide in the US in 2011. His sister, Leila, also died in 2001 from an overdose of sedatives. Such family tragedies have led many Iranians to believe that if the Pahlavi family cannot even manage their own household, they are even less capable of governing a country. With all these factors combined, the difficulty of Reza Pahlavi's attempt to restore the dynasty is imaginable. At this point, some listeners may ask, why did a protest that started with rising prices escalate to such a serious level? In fact, the outbreak of the large-scale protests in Iran in 2025 was not caused by a single factor, but the result of the long-term accumulation and superposition of multiple contradictions. These contradictions were like ticking time bombs, finally triggered by the straw of price and water crises. Let's sort out these underlying causes one by one. First, the most core external cause: nearly 40 years of international sanctions on Iran, which have directly plunged the Iranian economy into a long-term predicament. Since the 1979 Islamic Revolution, the US has imposed sanctions on Iran, and the scope and intensity of these sanctions have continued to expand over time. The sanctions have covered almost all core areas of Iran's economy, including finance, energy, and trade. Sanctions on Iran's central bank and oil exports have been particularly fatal, as Iran's economy is highly dependent on oil exports, with oil revenues being one of the main sources of national fiscal income. Long-term international sanctions have made it difficult for Iran to integrate into the global economic system and carry out normal international trade and financial cooperation. This has led to a severe shortage of Iran's foreign exchange reserves and continuous currency depreciation. As we mentioned earlier, in the first half of 2025, the Iranian rial depreciated sharply against the US dollar, with the amount of rials exchangeable for $1 increasing significantly. Compared to a year earlier, currency depreciation has driven up the prices of imported goods, further exacerbating domestic inflation. The purchasing power of ordinary people has become weaker and weaker, and life has become increasingly difficult. At the same time, sanctions have prevented Iran from obtaining necessary technologies and equipment, severely restricting its industrial production capacity and leaving the economy lacking momentum for development. A large number of enterprises have faced operational difficulties or even bankruptcy, and the unemployment rate has remained high. These economic hardships have plagued the Iranian people for a long time, and social discontent has continued to accumulate. This is also an important reason why the protests spread so rapidly. Second, domestic economic structural problems. Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps IRGC controls multiple core industries in the country, including military industry, construction and finance, and has propped up part of Iran's economy to a certain extent. However, the problem is that the development of these industries is more geared towards serving military and political purposes, and the profits from these industries are mainly concentrated in the hands of a small number of groups, making it difficult to truly benefit ordinary people. In the field of people's livelihood, public service resources such as education, medical care and housing are unevenly distributed and of varying quality, and ordinary people struggle to access high-quality public services. More crucially, the IRGC's monopoly on core industries has also squeezed the development space for the private economy. A large number of small and micro enterprises find it difficult to survive in this monopolistic environment, which has further exacerbated employment pressure. Although the Iranian government has attempted to introduce some policies to improve people's livelihood, these policies have mostly failed to be implemented due to a weak economic foundation and unreasonable resource allocation, and people's livelihood issues have never been fundamentally resolved. When people's lives are hard, discontent naturally grows stronger. Third, the last straw that directly triggered the protests, the worst drought in 50 years, leading to a fatal water crisis. Starting in the autumn of 2025, an unprecedented severe drought hit Iran nationwide, with rainfall hitting a record low and water levels in multiple reservoirs approaching depletion. Even the capital, Tehran, faced an extremely severe situation. According to public information, as of November 2025, Tehran had not received a drop of rain for more than 2 months, and the city's water storage capacity had plummeted by nearly half compared to previous years. To address the water shortage, Iran's Minister of Energy had to publicly confirm that the government had reduced the pressure on the water supply system, which led to water outages in some parts of Tehran between 2 a.m. and 6 a.m. due to insufficient water pressure. This was a desperate measure by the government, aimed at avoiding peak water consumption hours and buying time to repair aging water supply facilities. Iranian President Pezeshkian even issued multiple warnings that if Tehran continued to experience no rainfall, the government would have to implement more stringent water rationing measures. And in extreme cases, it might even be necessary to evacuate residents from Tehran. The fact that the president would make such a statement is a testament to the severity of the water crisis at that time. To make matters worse, Iran's industrial structure has further exacerbated water shortages. Iran's agricultural sector is dominated by rice cultivation, and rice is notoriously water-intensive. In addition, the oil extraction industry also consumes a large amount of water resources. These two water-intensive industries have clashed fiercely with domestic water use amid the severe water shortage. Moreover, most of Iran's urban water supply facilities are outdated, with serious water leakage problems, which has caused a huge waste of precious water resources. Beyond Tehran, Iran's second-largest city, Mashhad, and other places also face the problem of drying reservoirs, seriously threatening the normal lives of more than 4 million local residents. Water is the source of life, and when even basic drinking water becomes a problem, the people can no longer endure, which also became the direct trigger for the outbreak of large-scale protests. Fourth, chaotic domestic agricultural policies, which have further exacerbated people's livelihood difficulties. The Iranian government has made obvious mistakes in agricultural planning, blindly promoting rice cultivation, which has led to a severe oversupply of rice. The domestic market simply cannot absorb so much rice, resulting in a large backlog of unsold rice. Due to limited storage conditions, a lot of rice has deteriorated and been lost. As we mentioned earlier, rice cultivation itself is a water-intensive industry. Amid a severe water shortage, a large amount of water resources have been used to grow this unsellable rice, which not only wastes precious resources but also squeezes the planting resources of other crops such as wheat and corn, leading to a serious imbalance in the agricultural industrial structure. At the same time, the government lacks sound policy guarantees in the acquisition, storage, and sales of agricultural products. Farmers either cannot sell their produce at a reasonable price or cannot sell it at all. After a year of hard work, they not only fail to make money but may even suffer losses, pushing many farmers into poverty. Agriculture is an important foundation of Iran's national economy, and the poor state of agricultural development has not only affected the people's food security but also further exacerbated the country's economic difficulties and social discontent, becoming another important factor driving the outbreak of protests. Having analyzed the causes of the protests, what we care about most is undoubtedly, what will happen to Iran's situation next. At present, Iran's existing theocratic rule is indeed facing a serious governance crisis. But this does not mean that the rule will collapse immediately. The entire situation is full of uncertainty, and there are multiple possible trajectories for the future of the regime, which require continuous follow-up and observation. Let's first talk about the current crisis facing theocratic rule. First and foremost is the widespread and intense public discontent. The protests have spread to more than 100 cities, with participants including merchants, students, the middle class, farmers, and other social classes. The demands have escalated from economic issues to a rejection of the existing system, indicating that the social foundation of theocratic rule has begun to shake. Although the government has adopted a series of measures such as an internet blackout, crackdowns, and promises to improve the economy, it has not fundamentally solved the problem. Social tensions persist, and small-scale protests have not stopped, which poses a continuous pressure on theocratic rule. Second, interference from external forces has worsened the governance crisis. Western countries such as the US have long been dissatisfied with Iran's theocratic system. Seeing Iran's domestic unrest, they have naturally seized the opportunity to continuously intervene in the situation through statements, military deployments, and other means, seeking to dismantle Iran's theocracy amid the chaos. The US has not only publicly supported the protesters but also discussed tough measures such as military strikes and expanded sanctions, while also delivering ammunition and equipment to the Middle East to prepare for intervention. External interference has not only made Iran's domestic situation more chaotic but also seriously challenged the authority of theocratic rule. However, the theocratic rule is not without resistance. Judging from the current situation, Iran's elite class seems to have maintained a certain degree of unity, and Iran's security agencies, especially the IRGC, it still possesses strong strength, and its overall structure remains largely intact. Analysts point out that if its elite and security agencies can always remain unified, the possibility of this theocratic ruling system collapsing in the short term is actually very slim. As an important pillar of theocratic rule, the IRGC currently stands firmly on the government side and has participated in maintaining order and suppressing riots, which has to a certain extent curbed the further deterioration of the situation. Next, let's discuss several possible trajectories for Iran's future regime. 1. The the restoration of the exiled monarchy, which we mentioned earlier, but this possibility is relatively low. Although Reza Pahlavi has taken advantage of the chaos to express his desire to return to Iran, the memories of the dynasty's tyranny among older citizens, the younger generation's lack of identification with him, and his insufficient domestic support base all make restoration difficult to achieve. 2. The US installs a pro-US regime, which is the US's core goal, but it is also not easy to realize. Anti-US sentiment runs deep in Iran, and direct US intervention is likely to arouse the people's nationalist sentiment, uniting them against external forces and may even consolidate the existing theocratic rule. Moreover, there are disputes within the US over military intervention in Iran, and neighboring countries are unwilling to cooperate, all of which restrict the US's ambitions. 3. Iran's theocratic rule maintains power through reform and self-adjustment. Iranian President Pezeshkian has stated his willingness to listen to the people's demands and is determined to solve economic difficulties. If the government can truly introduce a series of effective economic reforms and people's livelihood improvement policies, effectively address the people's concerns about prices, employment, water resources, and other issues, ease public discontent, and resist external interference, it may gradually stabilize the situation and consolidate its rule. 4. A moderate faction comes to power. Adjusting the power structure within the framework of theocratic rule, balancing the interests of all social classes, and promoting Iran to develop in a more open and inclusive direction. In addition to these possibilities, there is also a worst-case scenario. The situation continues to be turbulent, and Iran plunges into long-term chaos. If the contradictions between all parties are not effectively resolved and external forces continue to intervene, Iran is likely to fall into long-term turmoil. This will not only cause severe damage to Iran itself and make the people's lives even harder but also affect the peace and stability of the entire Middle East. After all, Iran is an important country in the Middle East, and changes in its situation will affect the pattern of the entire region. From a regional and international perspective, the development of Iran's situation is also affected by many other factors. For example, the axis of resistance centered on Iran, including Syria, Hezbollah in Lebanon, and Shiite militias in Iraq. If Iran's theocratic rule collapses, this power structure is likely to undergo major changes, which will in turn affect the security balance in the Middle East. In addition, international forces such as Russia and the European Union are also closely monitoring the Iranian situation. Russia has always maintained a certain level of cooperation with Iran and opposes external interference in Iran's internal affairs. The EU is considering imposing additional sanctions on Iran, but there are also internal differences. The interactions and games between these international forces will further exacerbate the uncertainty of Iran's situation. Therefore, we cannot simply give a clear judgment on the future of Iran's situation. We need to comprehensively consider various domestic and international factors and continue to follow and observe developments. After all, the trajectory of a country's situation is ultimately determined by its people, and external interference has never brought true peace and stability. We hope that Iran can soon find a way to resolve its problems, quell the unrest, allow the people to return to a stable life, and contribute to the peace and stability of the Middle East. That concludes today's in-depth analysis of the Iranian situation in 2025, with all content based on public factual information. If there are new developments in the situation, we will continue to follow them and bring you the latest analysis. Thank you all for listening.